Hot off the presses, everybody. Hot off the press. So, last night we learned that Letitia James was calling a press conference this morning for an emergency big announcement. And right now is when we're getting that announcement. So let's listen, and we'll break it down as we go.
Good morning. Following a comprehensive 3-year investigation by my office, including witnesses, interviews with more than 65 witnesses, and review of millions of documents that were submitted by Mr. Trump and others, I am announcing that today we are filing a lawsuit against Donald Trump for violating the law as part of his efforts to generate profits for himself, his family, and his company. The complaint demonstrates that Donald Trump falsely inflated his net worth by billions of dollars to unjustly enrich himself and to cheat the system, thereby cheating all of us. He did this with the help of the other defendants, his children, Donald Trump Jr., Ivanka Trump, and Eric Trump, and former Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg and Trump Organization Controller Jeffrey McConney. Mr. Trump.
Now, Weisselberg has already gone down. Weisselberg has already gone down, and as part of his plea agreement, he has to testify against the Trump Organization. And so getting Weisselberg to flip was probably a major part of this.
Trump and the Trump Organization repeatedly and persistently manipulated the value of assets to induce banks to lend money to the Trump Organization on more favorable terms than would otherwise have been available to the company.
This is something he was caught dead to rights doing, by the way. He would overvalue his property when talking about it to like news outlets or trying to sell certain property, and then when it came time to report for his taxes, he would massively undervalue the property so that he would cheat on his taxes. Well, that's tax fraud. You can't do that. And he was very brazen about that for years. He also did insurance fraud and bank fraud. And now, it's all catching up.
To pay lower taxes, to satisfy continuing loan agreements, and to induce insurance companies to provide insurance coverage for higher limits and at lower premiums. This conduct was all in violation of Executive Law, Section 6312, which gives the Attorney General broad and special powers to go after persistent and repeated fraud and illegality. As part of demonstrating illegality under that section of Law 6312, we show that they violated several state criminal laws, including falsifying business records.
Wait. So they violated criminal law. Does that mean there's also going to be a criminal case here? Because all of the articles that I've read on this indicates it's a civil case. Now, a civil case still has some hefty punishments. So he could have a colossal fine. He could get the corporate death penalty effectively for his business. That's certainly on the table. But now she's mentioning it could be a criminal case. Oh, boy. Oh, boy.
Issuing false financial statements, insurance fraud, and engaging in a conspiracy to commit each of these state law violations. We believe the conduct alleged in this action also violates federal criminal law, including issuing false statements to financial institutions and bank fraud. And we are referring those criminal violations that we've uncovered to the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York and the Internal Revenue Service. As a result of these violations, we are asking the court to, among other things, permanently bar Mr. Trump, Donald Trump Jr., Ivanka Trump, Eric Trump, from serving as an officer or director in any corporation or similar entity registered and or licensed in New York.
Wow. Wow.
To bar Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization from entering into any New York State commercial real estate acquisition or from applying for loans from any financial institution in New York for 5 years. To pay for the financial benefits obtained as a result of the persistent fraudulent practices at an estimated $250 million.
Good googly moogly. That is one hefty fine.
And towards the end of my remarks, I will go into the other relief that we are seeking. At the center of the year-long financial scheme were the statements of financial condition that were prepared annually by and for Mr. Trump, specifically from 2011 to 2021. These statements were compiled by the Trump Organization executives and were issued as a compilation report by Mr. Trump's accounting firm. The statements are explicit that the preparation was the responsibility of Mr. Trump. We're starting in 2016, the trustees of his trust, Donald Trump Jr. and Alan Weisselberg, for the sole benefit of Mr. Donald Trump. Each statement was personally certified as accurate by Mr. Trump, or...
Let me just say, Letitia James, you don't fuck with her. She's the person who brought down Andrew Cuomo. Like, she ended a political dynasty in New York. Okay? She's fierce. She knows what she's doing. And the fact that she's making this announcement and going through all these details means they have him dead to rights on these things. This is the first time that there's going to be some actual accountability, at the very least for Trump's businesses. So this is crazy to watch. And I always told you guys from the very beginning, you know, I thought Russiagate was largely bullshit, and I told you some of the claims seemed exaggerated and hyperbolic. But what I told you all along is, he's a con man. I mean, he had to pay over $20 million because Trump University was a fraud. He was committing fraud. He was a real estate guy in New York in the 1980s. You can't be that unless you have mafia connections. And in fact, one of Trump's top lawyers was a lawyer for the mafia. So there was always incredibly sketchy business practices, and now it's caught up to them.
By one of his trustees as part of the loan process. In the statement, banks...
This isn't my feed, by the way. It looks like it's their feed.
Mr. Trump and Mr. Weisselberg would meet to review and approve the final statement every year. Mr. Trump made known through Alan Weisselberg that he wanted his net worth reflected on the statements to increase, a desire Mr. Weisselberg and others carried out year after year in their fraudulent preparation of the statements. And when asked about these meetings under oath as part of our deposition, both men, Mr. Trump and Mr. Weisselberg, invoked their Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, and they refused to answer. When asked under oath if he, Mr. Trump, continued to review and approve the statements after becoming President of the United States in 2017, Mr. Trump, again, invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege and refused to answer.
And by the way, Trump is a guy who has said repeatedly, if you're invoking the Fifth, you're guilty. It was one of his go-to rants. There's a compilation clip of him saying it like a dozen times. And then he ran to the Fifth Amendment. Now, by the way, this was him actually listening to his lawyers for once and doing it, which is the best thing he could possibly do if he's trying to protect his ass, which he is. But that says quite a bit, doesn't it, given his perspective on the Fifth Amendment.
Over the course of our investigation, we found that Mr. Trump, his children, the Trump Organization, created and used more than 200 false and misleading asset valuations on his statement of financial condition over that 10-year period. They issued statements that were in clear violation of general accepted principles in the general accounting principles in the United States, despite representing that these statements were prepared in accordance with these principles. Some of the common tactics they used include representing that Mr. Trump had cash on hand that he did not have, ignoring critical restrictions that would significantly impact property values when setting valuations, changing the methodology used to value properties from year to year without reason or notice, and using vastly different methods to value different properties even in the same year, and including tangible items such as brand premiums, the Trump premium, when calculating an asset's value, despite the fact that they ignored the advice of outside professionals. They also ignored the advice and appraisals of outside professionals, despite claiming those individuals provided certain figures. For example, they received a series of bank-ordered appraisals for the commercial property at 40 Wall Street in New York City that calculated the value of the property at $200 million as of August 2010 and $220 million as of November 2012. Yet, in his 2011 statement, Mr. Trump listed 40 Wall Street with a value of $524 million, which increased to $530 million over the next 2 years. More than twice.
I mean, he's astonishing, this guy. I mean, he really acted like he was invincible. He would be so sloppy and so shady with these actions. And I have no doubt that Trump probably didn't even think he was doing anything illegal. Because he's such a massive narcissist with such a gigantic ego, he probably convinced himself, like, this is what everybody does in this business. Well, it's not. And now the chickens are coming home to roost.
The value calculated by the professionals. Even more egregious, the $500 million plus valuation was attributed to information from the appraiser who valued the building at just over $200 million.
Fraud. I mean, just caught dead to rights. Fraud. Unbelievable.
Another deceptive strategy they employed was to use objectively false numbers to calculate property values. Take Mr. Trump's triplex. You know, the triplex apartment in Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue? Mr. Trump represented that his apartment spanned more than 30,000 square feet, which was the basis for valuing the apartment. In reality, the apartment had an area of less than 11,000 square feet.
This fucking guy, bro. This fucking guy. Oh my God. It's amazing he got away with it for this long, right? Like, credit to Letitia James, man. When you dot your I's and cross your T's and you actually, you know, get serious and do the work, well, turns out you can document many, many crimes.
Something that Mr. Trump was well aware of. And based on that inflated square footage, the value of the apartment in 2015 and 2016 was $327 million. To this date, no apartment in New York City has ever sold for close to that amount. Tripling the size of the apartment for purposes of the valuation was intentional and deliberate fraud, not an honest mistake. Mr. Trump was intimately familiar with the layout of both the building and the apartment, having personally overseen the construction of both. Despite his sworn testimony before and...
Sorry, guys, this is not me. This is this feed. This is, it's CNBC feed.
That using the false square footage improperly inflated the value of the apartment almost threefold. Mr. Weisselberg admitted that this amounted to a overstatement of, give or take, $200 million.
Ugh.
Misrepresenting the size of the apartment was only one of the many ways that Mr. Trump intentionally misvalued his asset for the purposes of increasing his net worth and inducing banks to offer more favorable terms. Mr. Trump also routinely ignored legal restrictions on development rights and marketability on properties that would significantly decrease property values. For example, let's take Trump Park Avenue in New York. This building contains both commercial and residential space. The unsold residential condo units owned by Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization represented the lion's share of the reported value for this property. Mr. Trump and his children intentionally ignored legal restrictions on some of the units that would have drastically changed the valuation. Specifically, the 12 of those units were actually rent-stabilized apartments. A professional appraiser valued those 12 units at around $750,000, noting that the rent-stabilized units cannot be marketed as individual units for sale because the current tenants cannot be forced to leave. Despite this professional valuation, and Mr. Trump knowing full well the legal restrictions the 12 rent-stabilized units were valued, he valued them collectively on his statements at $49 million. That is about 65 times the appraised valuation.
Holy fucking shit, man. Okay, here's a question. Has there ever been a single businessman in human history who has done more tax fraud, insurance fraud, and bank fraud than Donald Trump? I think that's a legit question. I think that's a fair question. It's comical, right? And then he had the nerve. This guy has the nerve. Like, with all of these crimes, an endless list of crimes, to, like, casually get involved in politics. And look, there was an extended period of time where he did appear Teflon, right? Namely because a lot of the attempts to go after Trump sort of overreached and were hyperbolic, and it sort of spurred on the base support for him. But I'm telling you, man, this is different. This is all catching up. It looks like his business is going down in flames. And I'm surprised by, she was talking about potential criminal case as well, not just a civil case when it comes to these business issues. And I'm surprised that the kids are involved too. She mentioned the kids. Oh, man. This is getting interesting, dog. Trump is about to melt down on Truth Social. Probably above and beyond any other meltdown we've ever seen.
Mr. Trump also blatantly ignored legal restrictions at Mar-A-Lago. Mar-a-Lago was valued on the false premise that it sat on unrestricted property and could be developed for residential use. However, Mr. Trump knew that Mar-a-Lago was subject to a host of onerous restrictions and limitations. Mr. Trump himself signed deeds sharply restricting changes to the property and donating his residential development rights in an effort to get a tax deduction and later to lower his property taxes on the property. The deeds also require Mr. Trump to donate over 23% of Mar-a-Lago's value to the Historic Trust for Historic Preservation if he ever sold it. Despite these significant restrictions, Mr. Trump valued the property based on the false premise that it was an unrestricted residential 18-acre plot of land that could be sold and used as a private home. In fact, the valuations represent that these restrictions don't even exist. The club generated annual revenues of less than $25 million and should have been valued at about $75 million. However, Mar-a-Lago was valued as high as $739 million.
This fucking guy, bro. What's amazing is that in this, like, one investigation into his businesses, like, how many crimes did she actually find? Like, it sounds like it's over 20 different crimes. Jesus, man. What a fucking scoundrel. Holy shit. It's unbelievable. Now, this reminds me of, like when I have to do my taxes, I am so strict with my tax guy. I'm like, I am paying every single penny that I fucking owe. Don't find any questionable, Weasley little roundabout thing where it's like, hey, this is technically legal, but it probably appears unethical. I'm like, no, I want to pay every single penny of what I owe. Because when you're some semblance of a public figure, namely, especially like a political public figure, it's like, okay, you gotta dot all the I's and cross all the T's and do everything correct. Because there's extra scrutiny, right? Now, thankfully, I'm not running for office, so for me, it's maybe a slightly different situation. But, like, this guy, he was the opposite. He was just flat out lying. He was lying endlessly. Jesus Christ.
Mr. Trump used inappropriate schemes to inflate the value of his other golf clubs. He valued the clubs based on their fixed assets. In other words, the money spent to acquire and to maintain them, despite being informed by valuation professionals that this practice was inappropriate for a club operating as an ongoing business. He again added a brand premium when determining the value of the club, but claimed in his statements that he did not. And he inflated the value of unsold memberships, often by hundreds of thousands of dollars per membership, even in situations where the memberships were given away for free at Mr. Trump's direction. Inflating his reported net worth was just the first part of the scheme. He then used these false statements of financial condition for his own personal gain. Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization have obtained hundreds of millions of dollars in real estate loans and insurance coverage using these statements. Mr. Trump was able to secure much more favorable loan terms by personally guaranteeing the loans based on his reported net worth, as reflected on his statements of financial condition. These statements were integral to Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization's ability to secure loans for a number of properties, including the old post office in Washington, D.C. Mr. Trump's statements were first submitted to the federal government to demonstrate his financial status, his net worth. He then engaged with Deutsche Bank to obtain a loan to redevelop the property. Mr. Trump was able to obtain much more favorable loan terms by personally guaranteeing the loans. So in 2014, he secured a loan from Deutsche Bank for $170 million. And as you know, in May of 22, Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization, they sold the post office, the old post office property, for $375 million, resulting in a $100 million net profit, which was the result of a loan he was able to obtain through the use of false and misleading statements of financial condition. Separately, Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization saved an estimated $150 million by receiving favorable interest rates that were only misleading statements of financial condition. Believe dollars in federal tax benefits, conservation easement donations related to Seven Springs in Westchester and the Trump National Golf Club in Los Angeles. And this conduct is not the subject of this action, but we are referring it to the IRS and to the Southern District of New York.
So one of the things that we're learning in this, again, is that she's talking about relaying criminal cases to the IRS, to the federal government, and everything I had read leading up to this point was that they're just doing a civil case, but it sounds like she's saying, no, I'm also recommending criminal charges, to the federal government. So that is definitely news, and again, it's news that the kids are implicated in this as well, and we got the news that the specific number of $250 million is the amount that they're going to try to get. So that's all news, man. But the other thing that's news is just the laundry list of crime. I mean, this is endless. I don't even know when she's going to stop, but she seems like she's just getting warmed up, and we've already covered like a dozen crimes.
The examples I laid out just barely scratched the surface of the misconduct that we have uncovered. The complaint, which all of you should have a copy, is more than 280 pages.
Oh my God, bro. Holy shit. And remember, for each one of these claims, she has evidence. For each one of these claims, there's evidence. I mean, we knew some of this was true based on previous reporting, but this is next level, man. His business, at the very least, is screwed. Like, big fine, $250 million. That's money he definitely doesn't have. I mean, I know he pretends, like he pretends like he's worth a lot more than he is. He doesn't have $250 million sitting around, man. He is... The jig is up, dog. I mean, this is... He's on the fucking ropes. He's on the ropes. And I feel a little vindicated in this because, again, I've maintained all along that the investigations into his business are... those are the most real. Those are the ones where I have, the most hope. But I am surprised that I wish this was also a criminal case, not just a civil case. But it may develop into a criminal case because these are so many crimes on top of crimes within crimes. I don't know how it can't.
Long. It includes examples from 23 assets that were grossly and fraudulently inflated, and those inflated values were used on Mr. Trump's...
And that's another point, man. He knew what he was doing. For the valuation thing in particular, he knew what he was doing. Now, again, he's such a fucking narcissist and egomaniac and pathological liar. Maybe he convinced himself that he didn't think it was illegal, but he knew that this shit wasn't worth what he was saying it was worth. And honestly, I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if he had the intention to commit crimes or if he just committed crimes without knowing. Either way, they're crimes.
Statements almost every year. All told, we uncovered more than 200 examples of false and misleading asset valuations that were used on his statements.
More than 200. Holy cow.
The pattern of fraud and deception that was used by Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization for their own financial benefit is astounding. Inflating the values of assets by whatever means necessary to increase Mr. Trump's purported net worth. And then that net worth was used to further enhance his financial standing, intentionally misrepresenting his financials to obtain incredible economic benefit. It was a scheme that, by its very nature, became more profitable over time. And it is all in stark violation of the law. As I mentioned earlier, the relief that we are seeking specifically, we are asking the court, again, to permanently bar Mr. Trump, Donald Trump, Eric Trump, Ivanka Trump, from serving as an officer or director in any corporation or similar business entity registered or licensed in New York State.
Okay, so that sounds like we're talking about corporate death penalty, right, for the Trump organization? I mean, I guess maybe they're saying the Trump organization can continue existing, but nobody in the Trump family can run it, which then I don't really know how much it is the Trump organization if at that point somebody else is running it completely, right? So, or at least for 5 years, they're saying you guys can't, run a business basically in the state of New York. I mean, I guess, is it possible they could just, re-register the Trump organization in a different state? I don't know. I'm not an expert on this stuff, so I'd be curious to know what an expert would say on that. But it sounds to me, this doesn't sound like the corporate death penalty, but it sounds like a pretty serious punishment here.
We are barring Mr. Trump and his organization from entering into any New York State commercial real estate acquisition for 5 years.
That also is powerful.
We are barring Mr. Trump and the Trump organization from applying for any loans from any financial institution registered with the New York Department of Financial Services for 5 years.
Well, that has to be like most financial outlets, right? In New York? I mean, New York is a hub.
We are requiring Mr. Trump and the Trump organization to disgorge the financial benefits obtained through the persistent fraudulent practices, a baseline, at the minimum of $250 million.
Now we get at a minimum of $250 million, not just $250 million.
And to appoint an independent monitor at the Trump organization to oversee compliance, financial reporting, evaluations, and disclosures to lenders, insurers, and tax authorities for no less than 5 years. We are requiring the Trump organization to prepare on an annual basis for the next 5 years a generally accepted accounting practices compliant audited statement of financial condition showing Mr. Trump's net worth to be distributed to all the recipients of his prior statements of financial condition. To replace the current trustees of the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust with new independent trustees or require similar independent governance if a new trust is created. And to permanently bar Alan Weisselberg and Jeffrey McConney from serving in the financial control of any New York corporation. And lastly, to cancel any certificate filed under and by virtue of the provisions of Section 130 of the General Business Law for the corporate entities named as defendants and any other entity controlled by or beneficially owned by Donald Trump, which participated in or benefited from the ongoing financial scheme. In other words, permanently prohibit any of these companies from doing business in the state of New York.
Wow. Holy shit. And you have to think, right, if all this goes through, can't you imagine, voluntarily, free of their own volition, all these big financial institutions won't want to work with him, all these other companies won't want to work with him, other states might follow in the lead of New York, right? I mean, I would imagine that there has to be reverberating effects to this, that there are, second-order and third-order consequences to what's going on here.
I want to be clear. White-collar financial crime is not a victimless crime.
Facts.
When the well-connected break the law to take in more money that they are entitled to, it reduces resources to working people, to regular people, to small businesses, and and all taxpayers. Everyday people cannot lie to a bank about how much money they have in order to get a favorable loan to buy a home or to send their kid to college. And if they did, the government would throw the book at them. Why should this be any different?
Oh, god damn, man. She is busting him up. Holy shit. This is accountability for once, man.
It is a tale of two justice systems, one for everyday working people and one for the elite, the rich and the powerful. Mr. Trump and his allies may say that these penalties are too harsh or that this is part of a witch hunt. I will remind everyone that this investigation only started after Michael Cohen, his former lawyer, testified before Congress and shed light on this misconduct. And the remedies are consistent with what we have sought for other businesses that committed the same misconduct. This investigation revealed that Donald Trump engaged in years of illegal conduct to deceive the people. Claiming you have money that you do not have does not amount to the art of the deal. It's the art of the steal.
All right, that one was a little corny.
And there cannot be different rules for different people in this country or in this state. And former presidents are no different.
Okay. This is crazy, man. She's going in. Look, she's fierce. As I said, she's responsible for ending a political dynasty in New York. So, you can't underestimate her, dog. She knows what she's doing.
And so today we are making good on that promise, on our commitment. Because no one is above the law.
God damn, holy shit. Wow. Well, this is quite the news here, man. It looks like Trump's business is going down in flames. Him, his kids, his top officials, and it sounds like they have just a mountain of evidence that proves this. So, buckle up, the ride's just beginning.